The birth certificate in my trembling hands had my name on it, Maria Elena Whitmore. Not Maria Santos, the orphaned maid who'd been scrubbing these floors for 15 years. Not the invisible woman who entered through the servants' door every morning at 6 a.m. Maria Whitmore, the name carved into the marble cornerstone of this mansion. The name on the family crypt I'd walked past 1,000 times, never knowing I belonged there. I'm still shaking as I tell you this story. 3 days ago, I thought I was nobody. Today, I'm sitting in what I now know is my own library, surrounded by books that should have been my inheritance, trying to make sense of a lie so massive it's stolen my entire life. You want to know how it feels to discover you've been cleaning your own home like a stranger? It feels like drowning in rage and heartbreak all at once. Let me take you back to that morning. I was doing what I'd done 5,000 times before, dusting the family portraits in the grand hallway. But something was different. Mrs. Whitmore was watching me, really watching me. And when I caught her eye in the reflection of the glass covering her great-grandmother's portrait, she looked terrified. "You have her nose," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. I turned around, dust cloth still in my hand. "Ma'am?" She was staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. Her coffee cup was rattling against the saucer in her hands. Nothing. Nothing. But I'd heard her, and suddenly I was looking at that portrait with new eyes. The woman's nose, her chin, the way her left eyebrow arched slightly higher than her right, just like mine did. That's when it hit me. After 15 years of being invisible, someone finally saw me, and it scared the hell out of her. I should have left it alone, gone back to my dusting, my mopping, my invisible existence. But something deep in my chest was screaming that this mattered, that I mattered. So that night, after the house went dark, I snuck back in. I know every creak in these floors, every shadow in these hallways. I made my way to the library, a room I'd cleaned but never truly explored, and I started looking. What I found hidden behind false-backed books wasn't just paperwork. It was proof of the cruelest theft imaginable. They didn't just take my inheritance, they took my identity, my family, my entire sense of self. They turned me into their servant and made me grateful for the privilege. The adoption papers were dated when I was 3 years old enough to remember, you'd think, but trauma has a way of burying memories so deep you forget they exist. The letter from my biological grandmother, Mrs. Whitmore's mother, was what broke me completely. "The child cannot stay. Richard's gambling debts will ruin us all. Better she grows up thinking she's no one than knowing she lost everything. Better I grow up thinking I'm no one." I've read those words 100 times in the past 3 days, and they cut deeper every time. But here's what they didn't count on. I remember now. Flashes are coming back. A woman with my eyes singing lullabies, the smell of roses in a bedroom that felt like mine, someone calling me little princess in a voice I thought was just a dream. This isn't just about money or property. This is about a family that chose to erase their own daughter rather than face their shame. A family that let me serve them for years, watching me clean the rooms I should have grown up in, and said nothing. Mrs. Whitmore knew. That look in her eyes yesterday, she's known all along. But they made one mistake. They taught me to be invisible, but invisible people see everything. And I've been watching, listening, learning for 15 years. I know their secrets now. Their debts, their lies, their affairs, everything they thought the help couldn't understand. I'm not their maid anymore. I'm their reckoning. And if you stick with me through this story, you're going to learn that the Whitmore family's secrets run so much deeper than stolen inheritance. There are other children, other stolen lives. There are bodies buried, literally and figuratively. And there are people in this town who've been waiting decades for someone like me to finally speak up. This is just the beginning. What I've uncovered about this family, about this town, about the web of lies that kept me scrubbing floors in my own home, it's going to change everything. Hit that like button if you believe the truth matters, no matter how ugly it gets. Subscribe because I promise you, by the time I'm done telling this story, you'll never look at wealthy families the same way again. And please, share your story in the comments if you've ever felt invisible, ever questioned your own past, or ever wondered what secrets the people around you might be keeping. Because after what I've discovered, I'm starting to think we're all living lies we don't even know about. The birth certificate in my trembling hands had my name on it. Maria Elena Whitmore. Not Maria Santos, the orphaned maid who'd been scrubbing these floors for 15 years. Not the invisible woman who entered through the servant's door every morning at 6 a.m. Maria Whitmore. The name carved into the marble cornerstone of this mansion. The name on the family crypt I'd walked past 1,000 times, never knowing I belonged there. I'm still shaking as I tell you this story. 3 days ago, I thought I was nobody. Today, I'm sitting in what I now know is my own library, surrounded by books that should have been my inheritance, trying to make sense of a lie so massive it's stolen my entire life. You want to know how it feels to discover you've been cleaning your own home like a stranger? It feels like drowning in rage and heartbreak all at once. It feels like every breath you've ever taken was borrowed. Every step you've made was trespassing on your own ground. Let me take you back to that morning. I was doing what I'd done 5,000 times before, dusting the family portraits in the grand hallway. But something was different. Mrs. Whitmore was watching me, really watching me. And when I caught her eye in the reflection of the glass covering her great-grandmother's portrait, she looked terrified. "You have her nose," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. I turned around, dust cloth still in my hand. "Ma'am?" She was staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. Her coffee cup was rattling against the saucer in her hands. Nothing. But I'd heard her, and suddenly I was looking at that portrait with new eyes. The woman's nose, her chin, the way her left eyebrow arched slightly higher than her right, just like mine did. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. After 15 years of being invisible, someone finally saw me, and it scared the hell out of her. I should have left it alone, gone back to my dusting, my mopping, my invisible existence. But something deep in my chest was screaming that this mattered, that I mattered. For the first time in my adult life, I felt the dangerous pull of curiosity, and I was terrified of where it might lead. That afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Whitmore's words, "You have her nose." I kept catching glimpses of myself in the polished surfaces I cleaned, searching for resemblances I'd never noticed before. The curve of my jaw, the shape of my eyes, features I'd always assumed came from nowhere, from no one. When evening came, I did something I'd never done in 15 years of service. I lingered. Usually, I'd finished my duties and disappeared through that servant store by 7 p.m. sharp. But tonight, I found excuses to stay. A spot on the banister that needed extra attention, flowers that needed fresh water, anything to keep me in that hallway with those portraits. The house grew quiet around me. Mr. Whitmore was in his study, probably drinking his way through another bottle of expensive whiskey. Mrs. Whitmore had retired early, with what she called one of her headaches, though I suspected this headache was more about avoiding my newly unsettling presence than any actual pain. I stood alone before that portrait, really looking at it for the first time. The woman was young, maybe in her 20s, wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But it was her expression that caught me. She looked sad. Not the practiced sadness of wealth and propriety, but something deeper, something that felt familiar. Her eyes held secrets, just like mine did now. I reached up and touched my own face, tracing the features I'd never questioned before. My nose, identical to hers. My chin, the same stubborn set. Even the way I unconsciously tilted my head when thinking, I was doing it now, and she was too, frozen in oil and time. So that night, after the house went dark, I snuck back in. I know every creak in these floors, every shadow in these hallways. 15 years of invisibility had taught me to move like a ghost, and tonight, I was grateful for that skill. I made my way to the library, a room I'd cleaned but never truly explored, and I started looking. The library felt different in darkness. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. Books that had seemed merely decorative during my cleaning routine now felt like sentinels, keeping watch over secrets I was about to uncover. My heart was hammering so loud, I was sure it would wake the entire house. I started with the obvious places. The desk drawers, locked. The filing cabinets, locked. But I'd watched this family for years, and wealthy people always kept spare keys in predictable places. I found them in a crystal bowl on the mantelpiece, hidden among decorative stones like Easter eggs waiting for discovery. The first drawer held nothing but bills and business correspondence. The second, social invitations and charity donation receipts. But the third changed everything. Hidden beneath a stack of old Christmas cards was a manila folder marked Family Records Confidential. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were documents that would shatter everything I thought I knew about myself. Birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records. And buried beneath it all, a letter written in handwriting that looked exactly like mine, because it was mine, from when I was 3 years old. Childish scrawls that said, "I love you, Grandmama," in purple crayon. The adoption papers were what broke me. They showed that Maria Elena Whitmore, age 3, had been given up for adoption to the Santos family. The reason listed was financial hardship and family reputation concerns. I wasn't just a maid who happened to work for the Whitmores. I was their blood, their shame, their dirty secrets scrubbing their floors for minimum wage. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on someone else's lie, and they'd been watching you live that lie for 15 years? The letter from my biological grandmother, Mrs. Whitmore's mother, was what broke me completely. It was dated 25 years ago, written in elegant script on cream stationery that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. The words were precise, cold, devastating. The child cannot stay. Richard's gambling debts will ruin us all. Better she grows up thinking she's no one than knowing she lost everything. Better I grow up thinking I'm no one. I read those words over and over until they blurred through my tears. My grandmother, a woman whose portrait I dusted reverently for years, had decided I was better off as nothing than as a Whitmore who'd lost her birthright to her father's gambling addiction. She'd sentenced me to invisibility before I was old enough to understand what visibility meant. But there was more. Other letters, other documents that painted a picture of systematic erasure. Medical records showing I'd been hospitalized at age 3 for severe emotional distress following my removal from the family. Psychological evaluations describing a child who'd stopped speaking for months. Reports of night terrors and developmental regression. They'd destroyed a 3-year-old's mind to save their reputation. The most damning document was a bank statement showing monthly payments to the Santos family, my adoptive family, for 25 years. They hadn't just given me away. They'd paid someone to take me, to keep me, to ensure I never came looking for answers. Every month, like clockwork, the Whitmores had paid for my silence without me even knowing I had something to be silent about. I thought about Mrs. Santos, the woman I'd called mother until she died when I was 18, the way she'd always seemed nervous when I asked about my past, the way she'd change the subject whenever I mentioned wanting to find my real family. She'd known I was serving my own blood, and she'd taken their money to keep quiet about it. Sitting there in that library, surrounded by books that should have been my inheritance, I felt something shift inside me. The obedient maid was dying, and something much more dangerous was being born. But here's what they didn't count on. I remember now. Trauma has a way of burying memories so deep you forget they exist, but sometimes a shock powerful enough can bring them all rushing back like a dam breaking. And sitting in that library, holding proof of my stolen life, the memories started flooding back in waves that nearly drowned me. I remembered a bedroom with yellow wallpaper and roses, my bedroom. I remembered a woman with kind eyes singing lullabies in a voice I'd spent 20 years thinking was just a beautiful dream. I remembered calling someone Papa who would swing me high in the air until I giggled so hard I couldn't breathe. I remembered feeling safe, loved, important. I remembered the day they took me away. The screaming, mine and my mother's. Strange people in suits talking in hushed voices while I clung to a stuffed rabbit I'd forgotten existed until this moment. The car ride to a house that smelled different, felt different, where a nervous woman kept calling me by the wrong name and telling me I had to be a good girl and forget the bad dreams. But they weren't bad dreams. They were my life, my real life. Before it was stolen and sold and buried under layers of lies and minimum wage servitude. I remembered birthday parties in the grand ballroom downstairs. I remembered helping my mother, my real mother, arrange flowers in the same crystal vases I now filled as a servant. I remembered believing I was a princess in a castle, because in many ways, I was. The cruelest part was realizing how many times I'd walked past remnants of my own childhood without recognizing them. The child-sized rocking horse in the attic that I'd dusted monthly for 15 years, mine. The tiny handprints preserved in the garden fountain's cement, mine. The growth chart penciled behind a door in what was now a guest bedroom, mine. I'd been a ghost haunting my own house, cleaning up after the life I should have lived, invisible in plain sight, while every surface held memories of the little girl I used to be. How do you mourn a childhood you didn't know was stolen until you were an adult living in its shadow? The next morning came too soon. I had to return to work, had to pretend I was still the same invisible Maria who'd left through the servant's door the night before. But everything had changed. I was walking through my childhood home with new eyes, and every familiar surface now felt like evidence of a crime. Mrs. Whitmore was waiting for me in the kitchen when I arrived. She was already dressed, her makeup perfect, but I could see the sleepless night in her eyes. She knew I'd heard her whispered words about my nose. She was watching me with the nervous energy of someone expecting an explosion. "Maria," she said carefully, "about yesterday." "Yes, ma'am." I kept my voice steady, professional, the same tone I'd used for 15 years. "I think perhaps we should discuss your hours. Maybe it's time to consider reducing them. You've been working here for so long, and you must be tired." She was trying to get rid of me. Now that she'd seen the resemblance she'd probably always noticed but chosen to ignore, she wanted me gone before I could figure out what she was really seeing. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not anymore. "I appreciate the concern, Mrs. Whitmore, but I'm not tired. I feel more energized than I have in years, actually." Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, maybe? Or recognition that the game had changed. As I went about my duties that morning, I noticed things I'd never seen before. The way Mr. Whitmore avoided looking at me directly, though I caught him studying me in reflections. The way certain rooms seemed to make Mrs. Whitmore uncomfortable when I was cleaning them, rooms I now recognized as pieces of my lost childhood. They'd lived with their guilty secret for 25 years, watching me grow up into the woman who cleaned their house. They'd seen me graduate from the awkward teenager who needed work to the efficient adult who'd become indispensable to their daily routine. They'd watched me and known exactly who I was. And they'd said nothing. Over the following days, I became a detective in my own life. I used my invisibility as a weapon, listening to phone conversations I was never meant to hear, reading mail that arrived when the family was out, paying attention to details that had seemed insignificant when I thought I was nobody. What I discovered was a web of lies that went far beyond my own stolen childhood. The Whitmore family was broke, had been for years. The gambling debts that had supposedly necessitated my removal had never been paid off. Instead, they'd multiplied, generation after generation, like a cancer eating away at everything my ancestors had built. They were living on credit and borrowed time, maintaining the facade of wealth through increasingly desperate measures. The artwork on the walls? Most of it was fake. The originals sold years ago to pay debts. The cars in the garage were leased, not owned. Even the jewelry Mrs. Whitmore wore to charity galas was borrowed from friends or rented from shops that specialized in helping the formerly wealthy maintain appearances. My inheritance, the money that should have been mine, had been spent long ago on lawyer fees, gambling losses, and the monthly payments to keep the Santos family quiet about my true identity. They'd stolen my birthright and then squandered it on their own weaknesses. But the most damning discovery came when I overheard Mrs. Whitmore on a phone call with someone she called Uncle Charles. They were discussing what to do about me, about my increasingly suspicious behavior, and whether they needed to take more decisive action. "She's getting too comfortable," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice sharp with anxiety. "She's asking questions about things that aren't her concern. Maybe it's time to let her go permanently." The way she said permanently made my blood run cold. These weren't just people who'd stolen my childhood. They were people who would do anything to protect their secrets, and I was becoming their biggest threat. I realized that my adoption hadn't been the end of their crimes. It had been the beginning of a pattern. They'd been covering up mistakes, burying evidence, making problems disappear for decades, and now I was their newest problem. That's when I made the most horrifying discovery of all. Hidden in a locked drawer I'd finally managed to open was a folder marked Family Management Confidential. Inside were documents that revealed I wasn't the only Whitmore child who'd been made to disappear. There were others, cousins, nieces, nephews, children whose existences had become inconvenient to the family's image or financial situation. Some had been put up for adoption, like me. Others had been sent to boarding schools that were really institutions. A few had simply vanished from all records, as if they'd never existed at all. The documents told stories of children removed for being different. A nephew with developmental delays, a niece whose mixed-race heritage didn't fit the family's white supremacist social circle, a cousin whose parents had died in a scandal that needed to be buried along with their child's memory. Each file contained the same cold calculations: the cost of maintaining the child versus the cost of their removal, the potential damage to family reputation, the logistics of erasure. Children reduced to accounting problems, solved with the same ruthless efficiency as any other business transaction. Some of the files had death certificates. Some had nothing at all, just names crossed out in red ink, as if the children had simply stopped existing when they stopped being useful. Reading those files, I understood that the Whitmore family wasn't just guilty of theft and fraud. They were guilty of systematic destruction of their own bloodline, generation after generation, sacrificing their most vulnerable members to maintain their facade of respectability. I thought about those children, scattered across the country in foster homes and institutions, growing up with no idea they belonged to a family wealthy enough to provide for them. I thought about the ones who hadn't grown up at all, whose disappearances had been covered up with money and influence, and the kind of connections that make problems disappear without questions. I was the lucky one. I'd survived, grown up, found my way back. But how many others were still lost, still searching, still believing they were nobody when they were somebody's stolen legacy? I couldn't stay silent anymore. Armed with evidence of crimes spanning decades, I made my decision. It was time for the Whitmore family to face what they'd done, not just to me, but to all of us they'd erased from their carefully curated history. I chose my moment carefully. It was Sunday evening, and the family was gathered in the living room for their weekly ritual of reviewing social calendars and financial reports. They looked so comfortable, so confident in their bubble of privilege and denial. It was time to burst that bubble forever. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said, walking into the room without being summoned for the first time in 15 years. "I think we need to talk." She looked up from her papers, startled by my tone. Mr. Whitmore barely glanced at me, still assuming I was there to serve rather than confront. Their son James, visiting from college, didn't look up from his phone at all. "Maria, this isn't appropriate. We're having a family meeting." "I know," I said, setting the folder of evidence on their antique coffee table. "That's exactly why I'm here, because I'm family too." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Whitmore went pale, her hands beginning to shake like they had that day she'd whispered about my nose. Mr. Whitmore finally looked at me directly, and I saw the moment recognition hit him like a physical blow. James looked up from his phone, confused but sensing the sudden tension in the room. "My name is Maria Elena Whitmore," I continued, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside me. "I'm your daughter, Mrs. Whitmore, the daughter you gave away when I was 3 years old because it was cheaper than facing your husband's gambling debts." Mr. Whitmore stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. Get out of this house immediately." "This is my house," I said, opening the folder and pulling out my birth certificate. "According to these documents, I have as much right to be here as any of you. More right, actually, since I'm the only one who's been honest about who I am." What followed was chaos. James dropped his phone, staring at me with the same features I saw in the mirror every morning, his sister's features. Mrs. Whitmore began crying, not from remorse, but from the terror of finally being caught. Mr. Whitmore tried to destroy the documents, lunging for the folder, but I'd made copies, multiple copies, stored in multiple locations. "You want to know what I've learned in 15 years of being invisible in this house?" I asked, pulling out more files. "I've learned about the other children, all of them. The cousins you sent away, the nieces and nephews you erased, the ones who disappeared entirely because they were inconvenient to your image." Mrs. Whitmore collapsed into her chair. We did what we had to do. You don't understand the pressures." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted. "You sacrificed children to maintain a lie. You stole our lives to protect your reputation. And you've been living with that guilt for decades, watching me clean the floors where I should have been playing as a child." James was reading over the documents now, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Mom, is this true? Is she really your sister?" I said softly. "I'm your older sister, James, the one they told you died as a baby." The confrontation ended with lawyers, police reports, and newspaper headlines. The Whitmore family's house of lies finally collapsed, taking their carefully constructed reputation with it. The truth about their systematic erasure of inconvenient family members became front-page news, sparking investigations that revealed similar practices among other wealthy families. But for me, the real victory wasn't the legal settlement or the return of property that should have been mine all along. It was the phone calls that started coming from other survivors, other stolen children who'd recognized their own stories in mine. We found each other, we who'd been made to disappear. We formed our own family, bound not by blood or law, but by the shared experience of surviving erasure and finding our way back to truth. I still live in the mansion, but now it's truly mine. I've turned it into a refuge for lost children, a place where those who've been made invisible can become visible again. The portraits in the hallway now include photos of all the stolen children we've found, their faces finally restored to the family history that tried so hard to erase them. My story isn't just about one maid discovering her heritage. It's about the courage to speak truth to power, to demand recognition when the world tries to make you disappear. If my journey has taught you anything, I hope it's that your voice matters, your story matters, and no one has the right to erase you from your own life. Hit that like button if you believe the truth deserves to be told, no matter how painful. Share this story if you've ever felt invisible or questioned your own worth. And subscribe, because this is just the beginning. There are more stolen children out there, more families hiding decades of crimes behind walls of wealth and privilege. Together, we're going to find them all.